The pin hit the floor of the schoolhouse with a sound like a gunshot. Gertrude Lawson stood frozen in the center of the room, her hand raised halfway to her head, her fingers trembling against the thick coil of dark auburn hair that had been wound so tightly at the nape of her neck for so many years that she had almost forgotten it possessed any other shape. The small child standing before her, 7 years old, gap-toothed, with 2 copper-brown braids and eyes the exact color of a summer storm, looked up at her with an expression of such innocent, earnest hope that Gertrude felt the familiar armor around her chest begin to crack in a way she had not allowed it to crack since the night Thomas Lawson had ridden out of her life and never come back. "Please, Miss Gertrude," the little girl said. Her name was Ada Carver, and she had the particular gift of making requests sound like the most reasonable things in the world. "Mama used to wear her hair down when she read to me. I thought it would feel more like a story. Like a real one." The sentence landed somewhere deep and forbidden inside Gertrude's ribs. She had not worn her hair down in years. Not since the scandal. Not since the betrayal that had stripped her of everything she thought she knew about herself and left her in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, teaching arithmetic and penmanship to children who did not know her secrets and did not ask about them. She had wound her hair up like a fortress wall on the morning she arrived, and she had kept it that way every single day since, because a woman with her hair pinned tight looked like a woman who had her life under control. A woman with her hair down looked like a woman who was willing to be seen, and Gertrude Lawson was not willing to be seen. Not until Ada Carver looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes that were so impossibly like her father's, and Gertrude's fingers moved of their own accord, pulling the second pin free, and then the third, and then the whole heavy, dark, auburn wave of it came down around her shoulders like a secret finally spoken aloud. Ada breathed in like she was witnessing something sacred. "You look like a princess," she whispered, and that was the precise moment the schoolhouse door opened. Calvin Carver filled the doorframe the way big men fill doorframes, not aggressively, but completely, the way a mountain fills a valley. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from years of working cattle and mending fences, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone bluffs that lined the creek outside of town. He wore his grief the way men in 1882 wore their guns, always present, never mentioned, absolutely central to who he was. He looked at his daughter first, because that was always where his eyes went. Then he looked at the schoolteacher. His hand gripped the doorframe. He had never seen Gertrude Lawson with her hair down. In the 6 months since she had come to Dusty Creek and taken the teaching position at the one-room schoolhouse near the edge of the Carver Ranch, Calvin had cataloged her with the careful, guilty attention of a man who tells himself he is simply being observant. He knew she arrived before any of the children each morning and left after the last of them had gone. He knew she took her meals alone at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and declined every invitation to Sunday socials. He knew there was a scar on her left hand, thin and white and old, that she sometimes pressed against the edge of her desk when she was reading, as though she was trying to hold herself in place. He had not known about the hair. The color of it in the afternoon light coming through the schoolhouse window was something he was entirely unprepared for. It fell past her shoulders in thick waves, rich and dark and shot through with copper and red where the sun caught it, and she was standing very still with one hand raised to it and her gray eyes wide and startled, and she looked like a woman stepping back into herself after a very long exile. "Papa." Ada launched herself across the room. Calvin caught her automatically, swinging her up, but his eyes did not move from Gertrude. "Miss Lawson," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Mr. Carver." She had already begun gathering the pins from the floor, her movements quick and practiced, the walls going back up with visible speed. "I was just—" Ada asked if I would. "It's all right," Calvin said. He set Ada down and cleared his throat. "We were meant to be picking her up an hour ago. I'm sorry for the lateness. We had trouble at the north fence." "It's perfectly fine. We were reading." Gertrude straightened, holding the pins in her closed fist, her hair still loose around her shoulders. She had not managed to put it back up yet, and they both knew it, and the awareness of that fact sat between them in the schoolhouse air like smoke. Ada tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa, doesn't Miss Gertrude look like a princess?" Calvin looked at his daughter, then back at Gertrude Lawson, and something moved across his face that he did not have a name for yet, but that he would spend several sleepless nights in the weeks to come trying to find one. "She does," he said quietly. "She surely does." Gertrude turned away and began pinning her hair back up, but she did it slowly. And she did not quite manage to get every pin back in place before Ada took her father's hand and led him out the door, and the last copper-red strand of it was still curling loose against the back of her neck when she finally closed the schoolhouse for the evening and stood alone in the prairie dark, pressing her scarred hand flat against her sternum and trying to remember why all the walls were there in the first place. The answer, as it always did, came back to Thomas. She had been 24 years old when she married Thomas Lawson in Abilene, Kansas. He was a charming man with gambling debts he had not mentioned, and a second woman in Wichita that he also had not mentioned. And when both of those facts emerged on the same terrible Tuesday in November of 1879, Gertrude had found herself standing in the middle of a life that had been built on a hidden motive she had never suspected, and a foundation of secrets she had never been permitted to see. The town of Abilene, being a town of limited mercy toward women in complicated situations, had made her departure swift and thoroughly ungracious. She had left with her teaching certificate, a small carpet bag, and the very firm decision that she would never again allow herself to be the kind of woman who could be made a fool of by the softness of her own heart. She had come to Dusty Creek because it was far enough from Abilene that her name meant nothing, and because the letter from the school board had asked no questions about her personal history, and because the town was small enough that she could exist in it without being truly known by anyone in it. She had not anticipated Ada Carver. She had not anticipated the way a 7-year-old child could walk through every fortress wall ever built, not with force but with the simple, devastating weapon of needing something from you that you actually wanted to give. She had not anticipated Calvin. The Carver Ranch sat 4 miles east of town along the creek, and it was the kind of place that had been built not for show, but for survival, solid and honest and a little worn at the edges, the way good things get when they are used instead of displayed. Calvin had built most of it himself in the years before his marriage, and he had kept building it after, adding a room when Ada came and adding another when his wife Ellen had gotten sick, as though more walls could hold more life inside them. Ellen Carver had died in the spring of 1881, 18 months before Gertrude arrived in Dusty Creek. She had died of a fever that the town doctor, a well-meaning man with limited training, had not been able to treat in time, and she had died with Calvin's hand in hers and Ada asleep in the next room, and the particular cruelty of that death was the way it had taken everything slowly enough that Calvin had been able to hope, right up until the very last hour, that it was going to be all right. He had not been all right since. He ran the ranch with a focused, grim efficiency that the cowhands who worked for him respected and quietly worried about. He raised Ada with a tenderness that he was better at expressing through actions than words, packing her lunch each morning with biscuits she liked and small wildflowers she had not asked for but always pressed between the pages of her school primer. He came to town for what was needed: supplies, mail, the occasional piece of business, and he left again, and he did not linger, and he certainly did not look at women. He had not looked at a woman since Ellen. Until the afternoon he walked into the schoolhouse and found Gertrude Lawson's hair down around her shoulders like an answered prayer to a question he had not known he was asking. The trouble was that he did not know what to do with that. He spent 3 days not knowing what to do with it. He worked the north fence until the repaired section was stronger than any section that had not been broken. He rode the far pasture twice when once would have been sufficient. He sat on his porch in the evenings after Ada was asleep and watched the prairie dark and tried very hard not to think about copper-red hair in afternoon light. On the fourth day, he drove Ada to school himself instead of sending her with the ranch hand, which he had been doing on days when the work was heavy. He told himself it was because Ada had mentioned that the schoolhouse needed new chalk, and he had some in the supply wagon anyway. He was aware this was not the real reason. Gertrude was already inside when they arrived. Through the window he could see her writing sums on the small blackboard, her back to the door, her hair wound up in its customary severe coil as though nothing had ever happened, as though no pins had ever fallen, as though no child had ever said please and no man had ever stood in a doorframe with his heart doing something it had not done in a very long time. He knocked on the doorframe rather than simply entering. She turned. "Mr. Carver," a pause, "and Ada, you're early." "I had chalk," Calvin said, and held up the paper-wrapped bundle in a way that he immediately recognized as being extremely stupid, and he could see from the slight, suppressed twitch at the corner of her mouth that she recognized it too. "Thank you," she said, coming forward to take it. "We've been running low." Their fingers did not touch when she took the chalk. He had made sure of that. But they were standing close enough that he could smell the faint soap and cedar scent of her, and he registered it with the helpless precision of a man who has been trying very hard not to notice things. Ada was already at her desk, arranging her pencils in a row with enormous concentration. "How is she getting on?" Calvin asked. "With her reading?" Gertrude glanced at Ada with an expression that was unguarded in a way her expressions rarely were when she was looking at adults. "She is exceptional," she said, and the warmth in her voice was genuine and quiet and did something to the air in the room. "She has a gift for it. She reads well above her age and she remembers everything. You should be very proud of her." "I am," Calvin said. He said it simply, the way he did most things. "Then she talks about you." Gertrude looked at him. "At home," he clarified. "She tells me things you've said, things you've taught her." A pause. "She's been happier this year than she's been since her mother passed." The words landed with great weight. Gertrude pressed her lips together and looked at the floor for a moment, and when she looked back up there was something raw and careful in her gray eyes. "She's a remarkable child," she said. She makes the teaching easy." "Miss Gertrude let her hair down the other day," Ada announced from her desk, without looking up from her pencils. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The silence that followed was profound. Calvin looked at Gertrude. Gertrude looked at the chalk in her hands. A red stain moved up from her collar to her jaw, and the sight of it was so utterly human and undefended that Calvin had to look out the window at the blue October sky to prevent himself from saying something completely inappropriate for a Tuesday morning in a schoolhouse. "I should get back," he said. "Yes," Gertrude agreed. "Ada." He crossed to his daughter, crouched to her level, and kissed the top of her head. "You be good." "I'm always good," Ada said reasonably. He stood. He put his hat back on. He looked at Gertrude one more time, and she was looking at him, and neither of them said anything. But the thing between them, the thing that had no name yet but was rapidly acquiring one, shook itself awake a little more fully in the space between them. He left. He drove back to the ranch with the reins in his hands and the sky enormous above the grassland, and he thought about the way she had said she makes the teaching easy with a gentleness that she had not intended him to hear. And he thought, with a kind of slow, terrified clarity, that he was in very serious trouble. Gertrude taught her lessons that day with an efficiency that her students found somewhat bracing. She assigned longer sums than usual. She was extremely precise about the spelling of every word. She called on Ada 4 times more than was strictly pedagogically necessary, which Ada bore with cheerful dignity, answering every question correctly and smiling at her teacher in a way that suggested she knew considerably more than she was letting on. After the children left that afternoon, Gertrude sat alone at her desk in the long prairie light and permitted herself to think about Calvin Carver for exactly 10 minutes, which was 9 minutes more than she had previously permitted herself on any given day. He was, she thought, a deeply honest man. Not simple, she was far too observant to mistake straightforwardness for simplicity, but honest in the way that good wood is honest, showing its grain without apology. He did not pretend to be recovered from his grief. He did not perform a cheerfulness he did not feel. He was still carrying Ellen, and he was not ashamed of it, and there was something about that open faithfulness, even in loss, that Gertrude found more dangerous than any charm Thomas Lawson had ever deployed. Thomas had been charming. Calvin Carver was sincere. She did not know what to do with sincerity. She put the thought away in the same locked place she kept all the others, blew out the lamp and walked back to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in the November dark, her hair pinned very tight, her chin slightly raised, her heart beating in a rhythm that was not entirely even. November in Dusty Creek was a cold, spare month, all bare cottonwoods and hard blue sky, and the smell of wood smoke from every chimney in the small collection of buildings that constituted the town. There was a general store run by a man named Philip Garrett, who was also the postmaster. There was a church whose minister, Reverend Aldous Webb, preached with more enthusiasm than precision. There was a saloon called the Two-Bit, which Gertrude did not frequent but could hear from her room at the boarding house on Saturday nights. There was a doctor, a blacksmith, a barber, and Mrs. Henderson's establishment, which also served meals to non-residents on certain evenings, and was therefore the closest thing the town had to a restaurant. It was at one of these meals, on a cold Friday evening in early November, that Gertrude and Calvin Carver found themselves seated at adjacent tables, and forced by the geometry of Mrs. Henderson's small dining room into a proximity that neither of them had arranged, and neither of them quite knew how to manage. Calvin was there because Ada had a persistent cough that he had brought her to the doctor about that afternoon, and by the time the doctor had finished pronouncing Ada's cough a minor irritation rather than anything to worry about, a diagnosis that loosened something painfully tight in Calvin's chest. It had been too late to make the drive home before dark, and so he had taken a room for the night and brought Ada to Mrs. Henderson's for supper. Gertrude was there because she ate there every Friday. Ada saw her first, naturally. "Miss Gertrude," she said it with the pure delight of a child who sees no contradiction between the worlds of school and not school. "Papa, look. Are you going to eat together?" "We are eating at adjacent tables," Gertrude said carefully, "which is not quite the same thing." "But you could," Ada said. "There's room. Our table has 3 chairs and there are only 2 of us." She looked at her father with the expression of a person making an entirely logical point. "Papa," Calvin looked at Gertrude. Gertrude looked at Calvin. The dining room of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was warm and lamplit and smelled of beef stew and fresh bread, and outside the window the November wind was making the sign above the general store creak, and the two of them stood at the edge of something that felt, to both of them, like a decision with consequences well beyond supper. "If Miss Lawson would prefer her own table," Calvin said, giving her the exit because he was that kind of man. Gertrude looked at Ada. Ada was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes, hopeful and patient. And Gertrude thought about hidden motives and forbidden feelings and the very firm decision she had made about walls, and then she heard herself say, "I think 3 chairs at one table is very sensible." Ada beamed like sunrise. They ate beef stew and fresh bread, and Ada talked about nearly everything she knew, which was considerable. She talked about the book she was currently reading, which was a collection of folk stories that Gertrude had lent her. She talked about the horse she was going to have when she was old enough, which she had named Clover in advance. She talked about the coyote she had seen from the window of the wagon on the way into town, which had been sitting in the grass watching them go past with what she described as a philosophical expression. Calvin and Gertrude listened, and occasionally looked at each other over Ada's copper braids, and the looks were careful and warm, and layered with things that neither of them were yet able to say aloud. "Ada tells me you studied in St. Louis," Calvin said, during a momentary pause in Ada's discourse. Gertrude set down her spoon. "I did, the St. Louis Normal School, teaching certificate 1877, she paused. Before that Kansas. Family in Kansas. Not anymore." He said it without inflection, which was itself a kind of information. Calvin absorbed this. He did not press. "My family is from Missouri. We came out here in '74. My father homesteaded. He's gone now. Mother went back to Missouri when Ellen," he stopped, looked at his stew. "After Ada's mother passed, she wanted to go back to her sister." "I'm sorry," Gertrude said. She meant it. "It gets easier," Calvin said. "Not less, just easier to carry." He looked up. "You know about that?" It was not quite a question. Gertrude met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "I do." They did not say anything else about it. They did not need to. The shared knowledge of grief sat between them not as a weight, but as a kind of understanding. And understanding, Gertrude was discovering, was a more dangerous intimacy than almost anything else. Ada had fallen asleep in her chair by the time the bread pudding arrived for dessert, her small head dropping sideways with the complete physical trust of a sleeping child. Calvin caught her automatically, settling her against his shoulder, and the sight of him doing it, so practiced, so gentle, so entirely unself-conscious about his love for this small person, hit Gertrude somewhere beneath all her careful armor with the force of something she was going to have to reckon with later. "I should get her upstairs," Calvin said quietly. "She'll sleep better in a proper bed." He shifted Ada carefully, rose, looked at Gertrude. "Thank you for the company, Miss Lawson." "Thank you for sharing your table," she said. He nodded. He started toward the stairs, stopped, did not turn around. "I'll be bringing her to school on Monday," he said, if you don't object to that." "I don't object to that," Gertrude said. He went up the stairs. Gertrude sat alone at the table with her bread pudding and the lamp and the sound of the November wind against the window, and she thought about sincerity and walls, and the way a man could carry a sleeping child and make you understand, without saying a single word about it, exactly who he was. She was in trouble. She had known it since the pins hit the floor. She just had not been willing to admit the depth of it until this moment. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of two people who are moving toward each other very carefully, the way you move toward a fire when you are not sure yet whether it will warm you or burn you. Calvin found reasons to come to the schoolhouse. Gertrude found reasons not to object to this. Ada, who was clearly not oblivious to any of this, conducted herself with the serene satisfaction of a small person who has arranged things exactly as she intended. He brought her books from the supply wagon, practical things he thought she might need for the school, chalk and ink and a new primer for the older children. But also once, a small wooden box he had made himself, with a sliding lid and a carved bird on the top, for keeping pencils. He said Ada had mentioned she kept losing them. He did not say he had spent 2 evenings carving the bird. She could see from the fine detail of the feathers that he had. She thanked him for the box. She kept it on the corner of her desk. Every time she looked at it, she felt the walls shift slightly. She also began learning things about him from sources other than himself. Philip Garrett at the general store, who was a talker of the first order, told her that Calvin Carver was the man who had repaired the church roof the previous spring at his own expense when the congregation could not raise the funds, and had done it on a Sunday so as not to lose a workday, and had told Reverend Webb it was simply a matter of good sense since a leaking roof was no good for anyone. Mrs. Henderson told her that the Carver Ranch hands all stayed year after year because Calvin paid fair wages and kept his word about everything, which she said was rarer than people liked to think. The blacksmith, a taciturn man named Cobb, told her, without being asked, that Calvin Carver was the best judge of a horse he had ever met, which Gertrude understood to be the highest possible praise. None of these things were surprising. They were entirely consistent with what she could already see. But hearing them from others made them solid in a way that her own observations had not yet made them, and solidness was what she had been afraid of. Because something solid could be trusted, and trusting was the one thing Gertrude Lawson was most deeply afraid of doing. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the hidden motive she had never seen, the secrets that had undone everything, the way she had believed in a version of her life that had been a fiction from the beginning. She thought about what it meant to be wrong about a person at that depth, and about the particular, lasting damage it does to a woman's faith in her own judgment. And she thought about Calvin Carver, who brought chalk and carved birds and caught his daughter when she fell asleep in chairs, and who looked at her sometimes with an expression so direct and honest that it made the breath come wrong in her chest. In December, the first real trouble arrived. It came in the form of a man named Dale Hutchins, who rode into Dusty Creek on a gray Thursday and took a room at the Two-Bit and asked around town about a woman named Gertrude Lawson. Philip Garrett, being a talker, mentioned it to Mrs. Henderson, who mentioned it with visible concern to Gertrude at supper that same evening. Gertrude's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Did he say who he was? She asked carefully. Said he was an acquaintance, Mrs. Henderson said. From Kansas. Gertrude set her spoon down. A cold, hollow thing opened in her stomach, because she knew who Dale Hutchins was. He was Thomas Lawson's first cousin, and he was also, she was fairly certain, the man Thomas had sent to Abilene the day before she left with a message she had been too afraid to stay and receive. She had run from Abilene, not from Thomas. Thomas had already fled to Wichita, but from the shame and the exposure and the dark past that felt like it was printed on her face for everyone to read. She had run toward anonymity and found it here. And now something from that dark past had apparently followed her 3 years across the state of Texas with a tenacity she had not anticipated. She lay awake that night with her hands flat on the quilt and her hair pinned at the nape of her neck even in sleep, the way she did when she was afraid, as though the tightness of it could hold her together. In the morning she went to the schoolhouse early, as always. She had been there perhaps 40 minutes when she heard boots on the step and turned to find not Calvin, not one of her students, but a man she recognized with a lurch of nausea. Dale Hutchins was not a large man, but he was a persistent one. He had flat eyes and a habit of smiling that did not reach them, and he stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and his smile already deployed. "Gertrude Lawson," he said, "you are a hard woman to find." "Mr. Hutchins," she kept her voice level and her chin up. "School begins in an hour. You'll need to say what you have to say quickly." "Thomas wants the watch back," Hutchins said. "The gold one. He says it was his grandmother's and it was not part of any agreement." Gertrude stared at him. A cold fury replaced the nausea with such totality that she was almost grateful for it. "Thomas Lawson forfeited any claim to anything when he committed bigamy," she said. "The watch was a wedding gift. I have the letter that says so. He says the letter doesn't mean what you think it means. Then he is welcome to contest it in a court of law." She turned back to the blackboard. "You are welcome to tell him I said so." Hutchins did not move. He'd rather not make it a legal matter, considering. Considering what? Considering that a legal matter would require you to produce yourself in a court, under your name, in a jurisdiction where people might remember certain things about certain circumstances. He paused. He thought you might prefer a quiet resolution. The trap was neat. Gertrude recognized it with the clarity of someone who had been caught in one before and developed a sharp eye for them. Thomas was threatening exposure. The implication was that she would rather surrender the watch than risk the public reminder of her disgrace, the dark past that could still reach out and make her life in Dusty Creek something she could no longer hold. She gripped the chalk so tightly her knuckles went white. She thought about the children who would arrive in an hour. She thought about the school board, 3 respectable men who had hired her without asking questions and who would, she knew, ask them very thoroughly if someone prompted them to. She thought about her room at Mrs. Henderson's and the small order she had built here and the only thing in her life that had begun, very slightly and very dangerously, to feel like more than just order. She thought about Ada. She thought about Calvin. "Get out of my schoolhouse," she said quietly. "You have until my students arrive. After that I will send for the sheriff." Hutchins put his hat back on. "You think about it," he said. "I'll be in town a few days." He left. Gertrude stood in the empty schoolhouse and breathed. She pressed her scarred hand flat against the edge of her desk. Outside, the December sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was moving through the dry grass, and somewhere along the creek road, she knew, Ada Carver was being driven to school by her father in the supply wagon. She made a decision. She was not going to give Thomas Lawson anything. Not the watch, not the satisfaction, not a single inch of the life she had built here. She was going to stand her ground, and she was going to do it alone, the way she had been doing everything alone for 3 years, because that was what she knew how to do. She began to write that morning's lesson on the blackboard and told herself that the shakiness of her handwriting was attributable to the cold. When Ada arrived with Calvin an hour later, Gertrude was standing at the front of the classroom reading aloud from a geography text, and she was perfectly composed, and the only sign that anything was wrong was the slight pallor beneath her usual color, and the fact that the carved wooden pencil box had been moved from the corner of the desk to the center of it, where she could see it. Calvin noticed. He noticed the way she was holding herself slightly differently than usual, too precisely upright, like a person bracing against wind, and he noticed the pallor, and he noticed that she did not quite meet his eyes when she turned to acknowledge him. He was not a man who pushed. But he was also, after years of managing a ranch and reading weather and understanding when something that looked all right was not actually all right, a man who paid attention. He sent Ada inside. He lingered in the doorway. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Perfectly fine," Gertrude said, in a tone that a person without his particular brand of attentiveness might have believed. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll be in town till noon today. Supply run. If you need anything before then, you can find me at Garrett's store." "Thank you," she said, "but I won't need anything." He nodded. He left. He told himself he believed her and did not believe himself. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Dale Hutchins had apparently spent some portion of his time not waiting for Gertrude to reconsider, but instead, with the particular vindictiveness of a small man doing a petty errand, making conversation at the general store. He had not said anything overtly damaging. He had simply mentioned, in the idle way of a man who is passing through, that he had known a woman named Lawson back in Kansas, and that she had been involved in some unpleasantness, and that it was funny to find her out here teaching children, and wasn't that interesting. Philip Garrett, to his credit, had not engaged with this very much. But he had mentioned it to the next person he spoke to, because that was simply what Philip Garrett did, and by the time Calvin came into the store at 10:30 for his supply list, the conversation had made one full circuit of the people present, and Calvin had heard enough of it to know that something was happening that went beyond idle gossip. He set down his supply list and looked at Garrett steadily. "This man Hutchins," he said. "What did he actually say?" Garrett, who was shrewd enough to recognize Calvin Carver's quiet voice for what it was, told him what he had heard as accurately as he could remember it. Calvin listened without expression. Then he picked up his supply list, completed his business with his usual efficiency, loaded his wagon, and drove not east toward the ranch but 3 doors down to the Two-Bit Saloon. He found Hutchins there at a corner table with a glass of whiskey and the look of a man who had accomplished his morning's work and was content to wait. Calvin sat down across from him without being invited. He put his hat on the table. He folded his hands. "I'm Calvin Carver," he said. "I have a ranch east of here. Miss Lawson teaches my daughter." Hutchins looked at him with his flat eyes and his professional smile. "That right? That's right." Calvin's voice was very even. "I also understand you've been in town making conversation about her. Just passing through, catching up with an old acquaintance." "I see." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to tell you something, and I'd like you to hear it clearly. Miss Lawson is a respected member of this community. Whatever she was or was not in a previous circumstance is her business, and the moment it becomes gossip in this town, it becomes my business as well, Because my daughter is in her care and I take an interest in her welfare." He paused. "I'd also like you to know that I have a good working relationship with the county sheriff, whose name is Earl Macready, and that if I have reason to believe someone is in this town with the intention of harassing a woman for purposes of coercion, I will be having a conversation with him before supper time." The smile on Hutchins's face flickered. "That's a strong word," Hutchins said. "Coercion." "It's an accurate word," Calvin said. "I'm a plain man. I use accurate words." He stood, picked up his hat, put it on. "I'd encourage you to finish your whiskey and get back on the road you came in on. The weather's turning north and the creek road gets rough when it freezes." He looked at Hutchins with clear, level gray eyes. "I'd be sorry to hear you were stranded." He left the saloon, walked to his wagon, and sat in it for a moment with his hands on the reins, breathing the cold December air and telling himself that this had been entirely about protecting the well-being of a teacher in the community, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that the idea of anyone threatening Gertrude Lawson had lit a fire in his chest so immediate and so absolute that he had not been able to sit still at Garrett's store for one more second. He drove to the schoolhouse. He was not sure what he was going to say. He knocked on the doorframe, which was his habit now, and she turned from the blackboard with surprise in her eyes. "The children, I know, noon break, they're outside, I need a moment." He came inside, closed the door against the cold, took his hat off. He stood in the middle of the schoolhouse and looked at her. "Hutchins was at the saloon this morning. I spoke with him." Gertrude went very still. "You spoke with him?" "I asked him to leave." The color in her face shifted. "Mr. Carver, that was not your—" "I know it wasn't," he said. "I did it anyway." He said it without apology, but also without aggression, simply as a fact about himself that he was willing to own. "I'm not going to tell you it was purely practical reasoning. It wasn't." He stopped. He was looking at her with that direct honesty that she found so impossible to defend against. "I don't know your history with that man or with whatever he was here about. I don't need to know it. What I know is that you are a good person and a remarkable teacher, and you have made my daughter happy in a year when I was very afraid she wasn't going to find that again. And I'm not willing to stand by while someone comes into this town to use her past against her." Gertrude stared at him. The armor which had been in place for 3 years and which had survived Thomas and Abilene and the cold, deliberate erasure of her old life, developed a crack so wide and so sudden that she actually pressed her hand flat against the nearest desk to keep herself upright. "Calvin," she said, and the use of his given name startled them both. He held very still. "Thomas Lawson was my husband," she said. "He had another wife in Wichita. He had been married to her before he married me. When I found out, I left Abilene. Hutchins is his cousin. He came to retrieve a watch Thomas wants back." She said it in a level voice, watching his face. "I kept it because it was given to me as a wedding gift, and I refuse to act as though I am the one who should be ashamed." Calvin met her gaze without flinching, without pity, without the careful diplomatic blankness she had come to expect from people who were trying not to show that they had revised their opinion of her. His expression did not change in any of those ways. Instead, what moved across it was a clear and uncomplicated anger on her behalf, and beneath that something quieter and more careful. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he said. She laughed very softly, and it was a laugh with sorrow underneath it. "That is not how most people see it. Most people are not always right." He said it simply, the way he said most things. "Then, did Hutchins threaten you? He implied consequences if I didn't comply. Then you should speak to Sheriff Macready. If I speak to the sheriff, the whole business becomes public. It's already public enough if Hutchins was talking at Garrett's store." Gertrude was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, at the gray December sky, at the children she could see playing in the yard through the glass. Then she looked back at Calvin. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question was direct, and they both knew it was not about the visit to the saloon. Calvin turned his hat in his hands. He was quiet for a moment that stretched between them. "Because I cannot walk into this room anymore without thinking about it all the way here," he said. Because Ada asked me this morning if I thought you were happy, and I didn't know the answer, and I realized I needed to." He stopped. "Because the day I walked in here and saw your hair down, He stopped again. "I've been trying to be reasonable about this. I'm not entirely sure I'm succeeding." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwoods by the creek. "I don't know how to do this," Gertrude said. Her voice was careful. "I thought I did once, and I was catastrophically wrong. I have spent 3 years building a life that doesn't require me to be, that doesn't risk." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I am very afraid," she said, which was the truest thing she had said to another person in 3 years. "So am I," Calvin said. "I am terrified most days." He said it without any apparent shame. "Ellen was my whole world, and she's gone, and I have spent a year and a half telling myself that what I needed was to get through the next season, the next roundup, the next winter, and that was enough. And then Ada started talking about her teacher, and He stopped. "I started looking forward to driving her to school." Gertrude looked at him for a long moment. "I need time," she said. "I know," he said, "and I need to handle Hutchins myself." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "I'd like to help, but I'll do it however you want." She nodded slowly. "Go to Sheriff McCready. Tell him there's a man in town attempting to coerce a local resident. Don't give him the full history, just enough to ask him to have a conversation with Hutchins about the appropriate time to leave." "I can do that," Calvin said. "I'll handle the watch matter through a letter to a solicitor in Abilene. I kept the correspondence. I have enough to make it a legal matter if Thomas wants to escalate." She lifted her chin. "Let him escalate." The corner of Calvin's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it had the shape of one. "There you are," he said quietly, and it was so unexpected and so gentle that she felt it all the way down. "There I am," she agreed, and meant it. The children came back in from their noon break, and the moment receded, but it did not disappear. It sat in the room between them while Calvin said goodbye to Ada and walked to his wagon, and it sat in Gertrude's chest all afternoon while she taught fractions and the names of state capitals. And when she walked back to the boarding house that evening, she walked differently than she had that morning. The way a person walks when they have taken off something heavy they have been carrying so long they forgot it was there. Dale Hutchins left Dusty Creek 2 days later, following a quiet conversation with Sheriff Earl McCready, a large, patient man who had a gift for making visitors feel that the road out of town was the most attractive option available to them. He left without the watch. Gertrude sent a letter to a solicitor in Abilene the following week. She never heard from Thomas Lawson again. December moved into the cold clarity of a Texas winter, and the world contracted around the warmth of fires and lanterns, and the particular closeness of a small town that has to pull together against the weather. Gertrude found that her world had contracted specifically around a particular ranch 4 miles east of town, and the 2 people who lived on it. Calvin had begun coming to Mrs. Henderson's for supper on Fridays, consistently, with Ada, and there was no longer any pretense that they were sitting at adjacent tables. Ada sat between them like a small, contented mediator, and presided over the meals with the authority of a person who has arranged things correctly and is pleased with the outcome. They talked about books and horses and the history of the land, and about Ada's ongoing philosophical observations concerning local wildlife. They also, gradually, talked about harder things. Calvin told her about Ellen, not in the careful, edited way people describe their dead to new acquaintances, but honestly, the texture and specific detail of a real marriage, including the hard years when they had disagreed, and the year when the ranch nearly failed, and the long, slow months of her illness, which he described with a steadiness that cost him something she could see. She understood, listening to him, that he talked about Ellen not as a warning to her, but as the opposite, as the only honest way he knew to say here is who I am and here is what shaped me, because he would not come to her under false pretenses. She told him about Thomas in the same spirit. She told him about Abilene and the marriage and the discovery and the departure, and she watched his face while she talked, and there was no pity and no revised judgment. There was anger on her behalf, which was clean and specific. There was admiration for the fact that she had rebuilt herself, which he expressed in a characteristically understated way, which was simply that he listened to everything she said as though it was worth hearing. Gradually, over the course of December, the thing between them stopped being careful and started being warm. He held the door for her at the general store, and their hands touched when he passed her a package, and neither of them pulled away immediately. He sat beside her at the church Christmas social, and their arms were touching, and they neither moved apart nor acknowledged it. One evening, walking from the boarding house to the church for the children's Christmas program, they walked side by side in the cold, and his hand found hers in the dark between them, and she held it, and neither of them said anything about it. And it was the finest thing that had happened to her in years. At Christmas, Ada gave Gertrude a drawing she had made, two figures standing together in front of a building that was identifiable as the schoolhouse, a tall one and a shorter one with long dark hair, which was Ada's version of Gertrude with her hair down, because that was how Ada had decided she would always draw her. Gertrude kept it folded inside the cover of the primer she carried home each evening. In January, the first real conversation happened. They were alone on the porch of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house after supper, Ada already upstairs asleep in the room Calvin kept for their Friday visits, the January stars enormous above the prairie, the cold absolute and clean. They had been standing for perhaps 5 minutes in a comfortable silence that had none of the early awkwardness in it anymore, when Calvin turned and looked at her with an expression that she recognized as one she had not seen from him before, a kind of careful, serious focus that meant he was about to say something considered. "I want to court you," he said, "properly, if you're willing." Gertrude looked at the stars for a moment. She had been waiting for this and dreading it in equal measure for weeks. "I have a history," she said. "I know your history. I'm asking you anyway. I am not always easy to know. I didn't say I wanted easy. I said I wanted you." She turned and looked at him, and the January starlight was on his face, and he was looking at her with that complete, honest directness that she had been trying not to fall in love with since October, and she was discovering that there are certain things you cannot actually choose not to fall in love with. You can only choose what to do about it afterward. "Yes," she said, "if you're certain." "I'm certain," he said. He reached out and gently, with great care, tucked the loose strand of hair that had escaped her pin behind her ear. His fingers brushed her temple, and she closed her eyes briefly at the touch, and when she opened them he was still looking at her with the same unhurried, steady attention. "I should get back," he said, "but I'll come by the schoolhouse Monday morning." A pause, the shape of a smile, with legitimate chalk this time. She laughed, and the laugh was real and full and unguarded, and it surprised her, the richness of it, the way it came from a part of her chest that had been quiet for a long time. "I look forward to it," she said. January and February were the months of the courtship, and they were among the finest months of Gertrude Lawson's adult life. Calvin came to the schoolhouse not just in the mornings but on Saturday afternoons, when school was not in session, and they walked along the creek where the ice was thickening along the edges, talking about everything. He showed her the north pasture where the cattle grazed through the winter, great patient beasts in the cold air. And she showed him the letter from the solicitor in Abilene confirming that Thomas Lawson's claim to the watch had no legal standing, which she had received in mid-January, and which she was carrying in her coat pocket in the manner of a person who has won something important and wants to keep the evidence close. He taught her to saddle a horse she could ride, but had only ever been put up by others, never saddled one herself, and she taught him to play chess, which she had learned at the normal school in St. Louis, and which he took to with a focused intensity that suggested he was going to be considerably better at it than her within a month. He was. She was not remotely sorry about this. Ada watched all of this with the serenity of a person whose plan has come to full fruition. She was 7 years old, and she did not have the vocabulary for what she was doing, but she had the instinct, which was that her father needed someone to talk to, and her teacher needed someone to trust, and she herself needed all the people she loved to be in the same place, which was, ideally, the Carver Ranch. She began, in February, to mention this last point with increasing frequency. "Miss Gertrude," she said one afternoon when her father was waiting outside and Gertrude was helping her wind her muffler, "do you think you might ever want to live on a ranch?" Gertrude finished the muffler carefully. "That's an interesting question." "I have a lot of interesting questions," Ada said. "I know you do." Gertrude looked at her, this small, serious person with the storm-gray eyes who had walked through every wall she had ever built. "Are you asking me something specific, Ada?" Ada appeared to consider. "I'm asking if you might want to be my mother," she said, with the directness of a person who has decided that the indirect approach is taking too long. Gertrude sat down on the bench beside Ada's desk. The schoolhouse was empty. Outside, the February light was pale and cold, and the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to show the very first hint of green at the tips. "Your father and I are still getting to know each other," she said. "You've been walking along the creek together for 6 weeks," Ada said, "and you had supper with us at Christmas and you and Papa talked for 2 hours after I went to bed. I know because I could hear you through the floor and it didn't bother me at all because it sounded nice." Gertrude pressed her lips together to contain the smile. "Eavesdropping is not a scholarly virtue." "No," Ada agreed readily, "but it is practical." She looked at her teacher with those eyes. "I miss having a mother," she said. "I miss it every day. And I like you better than anyone except Papa." She paused. "I'm not trying to make you feel like you have to. I just wanted you to know." Gertrude put her arm around Ada and held her for a moment, this small, fierce, honest child, and felt something in her open so wide and so finally that there was no closing it again. "I know," she said. "I know, sweetheart." She told Calvin that evening on the porch what Ada had said. She did not make it a pressure. She told it as the truth of the situation and let it sit. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was going to wait until spring. Give you more time." But Ada has never been particularly patient. "She takes after her father in some ways," Gertrude said. He looked at her with a startled expression that softened almost immediately. "Does she?" "Only the good ones." She met his eyes. "She told me she misses having a mother." I think she was trying to say something more general about what she'd like the future to look like. "And what would you like it to look like?" he asked, direct as always. Gertrude looked out at the February dark and the enormous Texas sky above it. She thought about St. Louis and Abilene and the cold departure and the years of careful, solitary rebuilding. She thought about pins on a schoolhouse floor and a little girl who asked for something simple with the power to undo everything. She thought about walls and what they were for and what they cost. "I would like to stop being afraid," she said. "I would like to trust what I can see in front of me instead of what has happened before." She looked at him. "I would like to say yes to you if you are going to ask." Calvin reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring. It was a plain gold band, clean and unornamental, and it had been his mother's, and he had written to her in Missouri in January asking if he might have it, and she had sent it back with a letter that said she had been hoping for exactly this kind of news. "I am going to ask," he said. "Gertrude Lawson, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, she looked at him. She thought about every reason she had spent 3 years accumulating against exactly this, and discovered that not one of them was strong enough to stand up against the reality of Calvin Carver on a February night asking her with a plain gold ring, and honest gray eyes and no hidden motive and no secrets she had not already been told. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put the ring on her finger and she held her hand up and looked at it in the lamplight from the boarding house window, and it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary sight she had ever seen. "I should tell you," he said, "that Ada is going to be insufferable about this." "I know," Gertrude said and laughed, and let him pull her against his side in the cold February dark. They were married in April. The ceremony was held at the Dusty Creek Church on a clear spring morning, with Reverend Webb conducting with more emotion than precision, which turned out to be exactly right for the occasion. Mrs. Henderson cried. Philip Garrett told everyone later that he had absolutely not cried, but several people were prepared to contradict this. The ranch hands came in their good shirts and stood in a row in the pews with their hats in their hands. Ada was the only attendant, which was her own specification. She wore a blue dress that Calvin had bought in San Antonio on a supply run, which she had been consulted about by letter and had approved in advance. She stood beside Gertrude with great seriousness and held the small bouquet of wildflowers that Gertrude had arranged, and when Reverend Webb asked if anyone had any reason to object to the marriage, Ada looked around the church with an expression so quelling that the Reverend actually paused before continuing. Gertrude wore her hair down. She had made that decision alone, standing in front of the small mirror in her room at the boarding house that morning, looking at the woman in it. She had held the pins in her hand, and she had thought about 3 years of keeping herself contained and controlled and safe from the kind of exposure that allowed people to see you clearly. And she had thought about Ada's voice saying it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And she had put the pins down on the dresser and left her hair down for the first time in years, truly down, not loose in a schoolhouse from surprise but deliberately on purpose, because she was choosing to be seen. When she came through the church door on the arm of Mrs. Henderson, who stood in for a lack of family with great dignity and considerable pride, Calvin turned from the front of the church and looked at her. The expression on his face was not something Gertrude had words for and did not need them. It was simply him, looking at her, in full. Ada's mouth curved into the widest smile Gertrude had ever seen on her small face. The ceremony was brief and correct, and the vows were the standard words of 1883 Texas, but Gertrude and Calvin said them with a weight of meaning that came from knowing exactly what they were undertaking and choosing it anyway, which is the only way any vow means anything. When Reverend Webb pronounced them married, Ada took both of their hands and held them, which was not technically part of the ceremony, but which no one present felt inclined to object to. The spring and summer of 1883 were the season in which Gertrude Lawson became Gertrude Carver and discovered what it meant to build a life rather than simply maintain one. She moved into the ranch house and found it to be the place she had been imagining without knowing it, solid and honest and worn in the right places, with a kitchen that got good light in the morning and a porch that faced west for the sunsets. She brought her books and her teaching materials and the carved pencil box, which she put on the window ledge of the room she used for writing, and which she considered to be the beginning of the whole thing. She continued teaching. She had made this clear before the wedding, and Calvin had supported it without hesitation. "You are a teacher," he had said simply, which was the right answer. The school board, after a brief initial awkwardness about the propriety of a married woman teaching, was persuaded by the practical argument that there was no one else in Dusty Creek qualified to take the position, and that the children were thriving, which was harder to argue with than principles. Ada thrived in ways that went beyond school. She thrived the way a plant does when the soil around it suddenly becomes what it needed. She was still intense and philosophical and direct, but there was a new ease in her that moved Gertrude every time she saw it, a lightness that had come from having all the people she needed in the same place. She took to calling Gertrude Mama about 6 weeks after the wedding on a Tuesday morning casually in the middle of a sentence about what she wanted for her birthday, and then looked up and waited. Gertrude set down the spoon she was holding. "Ada," she said. "Is that all right?" Ada asked. Gertrude crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and crouched down and held Ada's face in both hands and looked at her straight. "That is more than all right," she said. "That is the best thing anyone has ever called me." Ada nodded with satisfaction. "Good," she said, "because I've been waiting to say it for a while and I was getting impatient." Calvin, who was standing in the doorway to the kitchen having witnessed this entire exchange, quietly excused himself to the porch, where he stood in the early morning sun with his hand over his face for a long moment before he could trust himself to come back inside. There were hard things in the adjustment too, because building a life together always involves hard things. And Gertrude and Calvin were both people who had been alone for long enough that certain habits of independence were deeply worn in. Gertrude found the ranch work more physically demanding than she had expected and was proud enough to push through the exhaustion rather than say so, until Calvin noticed her hands at supper one evening and said, very quietly, "You don't have to do all of it at once." She had looked at him with the automatic defensiveness of someone who has been managing everything alone for years, and he had simply held her gaze until the defensiveness let go of her. Calvin found sharing decisions about the house, the accounts, the daily management of things more complicated than he had anticipated, not because he did not want to share them, but because 3 years of making every choice alone had carved grooves in his thinking that required conscious redirecting. More than once, Gertrude came home from the schoolhouse to find that he had made a decision about something domestic without consulting her, and on 2 occasions this led to short, honest, somewhat tense conversations about what it meant to make a life jointly rather than in parallel. They had both learned, in different ways, how to be alone. They were learning together how to be otherwise. The honesty between them was what made it work. They did not let things accumulate. They said the thing, even when the thing was difficult, because they were both people who had been damaged by unsaid things. She by Thomas's hidden motives, he by the particular silence of grief, and they had, without ever formally agreeing to it, decided that they would rather have the uncomfortable truth than the comfortable fiction. In the autumn of 1883, Gertrude discovered she was expecting. She told Calvin on the porch. On an October evening very close to the anniversary of the afternoon, the pins had fallen in the schoolhouse, which she had not done deliberately, but which struck her later as appropriate. She told him directly, as she told him most things, and watched his face move through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, and then a spreading, unguarded, luminous joy that was unlike any expression she had seen on him and that she thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever been the cause of. He stood up and took her hands and held them, both of them, and looked at her. "Gertrude," he said, "just her name." "I know," she said. "Are you?" "I'm well." "A little tired." "Very well." She squeezed his hands. "We should tell Ada." Ada received this information the next morning at breakfast with an expression of profound vindication, as though the universe had finally confirmed something she had known all along. She asked a series of extremely practical questions about the timing and the logistics, and when Calvin attempted to explain that they didn't know yet whether the baby was a boy or a girl, Ada looked at him patiently. "I know," she said. "I would like a brother." "I'll see what can be arranged," Calvin said. "You should tell the baby it's expected," Ada said to Gertrude very seriously. "I read that babies can hear things." "I'm not sure that's," Gertrude began. "I read it in one of your books," Ada said. "The one on natural philosophy." She paused. "Page 42. Gertrude made a mental note to review the natural philosophy texts in her collection for age appropriateness. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was a full one. Gertrude taught through November and December and into January, when the school board, with visible relief at having a reason to enforce propriety, suggested she take her leave. She did not argue with this. She turned the school over to a temporary teacher, a young man from San Antonio named Mr. Price, who was adequate if uninspiring, and she found that the months at home were not the confinement she had feared, but a different kind of work running the household, helping with the ranch accounts, which Calvin had asked her to take on because her head for figures was better than his, and continuing the particular ongoing education of Ada Carver, who had opinions about everything and sufficient intelligence to back most of them up. She also, in those winter months, wrote letters. She wrote to her sister in Wichita, from whom she had been estranged for 3 years because the shame of the Thomas affair had made contact feel impossible. The letter took her 4 drafts. She sent the 5th. Her sister wrote back within 3 weeks, a letter full of relief and news and the careful warmth of someone who had been hoping for exactly this contact. Gertrude cried reading it, in the kitchen, alone, and then dried her eyes and wrote back immediately. She wrote to her former professor from the St. Louis Normal School, a woman named Professor Clara Vickers, who had been the first person to tell her that her intellect was a gift rather than an inconvenience. She had not corresponded with her in years. Professor Vickers wrote back a long, delighted letter, and they began a correspondence that would continue for many years. She was reconnecting the threads of herself that she had cut in the flight from Abilene, picking them back up one by one, finding that more of them were retrievable than she had believed. It was not a dramatic thing. It was small and steady and profoundly healing, the way the right kind of thing always is. In March of 1884, on a cold night with the stars very bright and the prairie very still and Calvin's hand in hers throughout, Gertrude gave birth to a boy. He came into the world at 2 o'clock in the morning, howling with the full vigor of a person who has strong opinions about his arrival, and he was red and furious and perfect. And Calvin held him first because Gertrude needed a moment to simply breathe, and she watched her husband hold their son with the same complete, unself-conscious tenderness with which he did everything that mattered, and the love she felt in that room was of a magnitude and quality she had no prior frame of reference for. They named him James Calvin Carver, Calvin after his father, James after Calvin's father, who had built the ranch and the life on which all of this rested. Ada, when she met him the next morning, looked at him with the careful assessment of a serious person encountering something important. She held him with Gertrude's hand supporting her, and James looked up at her with new, unfocused eyes. "Hello," Ada said to him with great seriousness. "I'm Ada, I'm your sister, I've been waiting for you." James regarded her with the philosophical expression of the very newborn. "He has Papa's nose," Ada said. "He does," Gertrude agreed. "He has your hair," Ada said. He did, a fine, dark, auburn fuzz of it, already unmistakably the color of his mother's, laid flat against his small head like a promise. The spring of 1884 opened the way springs do after hard winters, with excess and generosity, the creek running full, and the grassland going green almost overnight, and the cottonwoods sending out their white cotton that drifted through the air like slow snow. Gertrude returned to the schoolhouse in April, taking James in the morning and leaving him with the ranch cook, a woman named Berta who had 3 grown children of her own and who took to James with immediate authority. Life settled into the shape of itself. Ada turned 8 in May, and then 9, and then 10, each year adding new layers to the person she was becoming, which was someone formidably intelligent and surprisingly kind, and possessed of a practical wisdom that sometimes made Calvin and Gertrude look at each other over her head with expressions of combined pride and mild alarm. She read voraciously and remembered everything and had opinions, by the time she was 10, about political and historical matters that would have been impressive in a person twice her age. James grew from the howling urgency of his early months into a cheerful, physical, curious boy who was nothing like his sister in temperament and everything like her in stubbornness, which suggested that this particular quality was a Carver trait rather than an Ada-specific one. He learned to walk at 10 months, fell down with magnificent frequency for the next 3 years, and was deeply untroubled by any of it. He followed his father around the ranch like a small, determined shadow from the moment he could walk, and Calvin bore this with the helpless delight of a man who cannot believe his luck. By the summer of 1885, the Carver ranch was prosperous in the quiet, earned way of things that have been worked for rather than happened upon. Calvin had expanded the herd and rebuilt the north barn that had been leaning dangerously since the previous winter. Gertrude had established a small lending library at the schoolhouse, funded partially by donations from the community and partially by a grant she had applied for with considerable persistence from the State Education Board, which had been surprised to receive such a well-argued application from a one-room schoolhouse in a town the size of Dusty Creek, and had approved it after 2 months of deliberation. Mrs. Henderson had become, over the 2.5 years of Gertrude's time in Dusty Creek, something close to family. She attended every Sunday supper at the ranch and spoiled Ada and James in the manner of a self-appointed grandmother, and she had developed a habit of knitting items for the children that were technically too small or too large, but always received with complete sincerity. Gertrude's sister, Margaret, came to visit in the autumn of 1885, traveling from Wichita on the train to Abilene and then by stage to Dusty Creek, a journey she described as character building. She was a tall, sharp-spoken woman with Gertrude's gray eyes and a very different manner, and Calvin liked her immediately and permanently after she told him at supper on the first evening that he had better be exactly as good as Gertrude, said he was or she would be having words with him. He had said he hoped he was and that she should feel entirely free to let him know if she determined otherwise, and she had looked at him for a long moment and then smiled and said, "All right then, pass the bread." Margaret stayed for 2 weeks and left in tears, which she disguised as the effects of the dust on the road, and wrote to Gertrude every 2 weeks thereafter for the rest of their lives. In 1886, there was a drought. It was not catastrophic, but it was serious, and it occupied Calvin through the summer with the particular grinding, relentless worry of a man watching his land and his livelihood strain against the weather's indifference. Gertrude, for her part, ran the household with a careful efficiency during the drought months, went over the accounts with Calvin each evening to find the places where they could be spared without damaging the long term, and at no point suggested that the situation was other than what it was, which was hard but manageable. He told her once, sitting on the porch in the August heat watching the dry grass, that he did not know how he would have done this alone. She had taken his hand and said she was glad he didn't have to find out. It was one of the truest things either of them ever said to each other. The drought broke in late September with 3 days of steady rain that turned the creek brown and the grassland green again with an almost indecent speed, and Calvin stood on the porch watching the rain come down with an expression so raw and so relieved that Gertrude put her arms around him from behind and simply held on. "It's going to be all right," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it is." James, who was 2.5 and not fully apprised of the agricultural situation, ran in circles in the rain until Gertrude brought him in and wrapped him in a blanket and deposited him, wet and delighted, in front of the fire. The years moved forward with the patient inevitability of good things, which is to say not without difficulty, but with enough joy to make the difficulty bearable and enough honesty to make the joy feel earned. In 1887, Gertrude became the head of a 2-teacher school. Dusty Creek had grown enough to require it, and she hired a young woman from Austin named Miss Holloway, who was 22 and earnest and exceptionally talented, and whom Gertrude mentored with the same thoughtful attention that Professor Clara Vickers had once shown her. She wrote to Professor Vickers about this, and Professor Vickers wrote back that this was the truest measure of a teacher's success, which Gertrude thought about for a long time. Ada, who was 12 by 1887, had begun talking about going to a proper school in the city for her secondary education, a conversation that Calvin approached with the mixture of fierce pride and absolute terror appropriate to the topic. Gertrude advocated for Ada with clear conviction, arguing that Ada's gifts required more than a 2-teacher school in Dusty Creek could provide, and that the sacrifice of having her away during the school year was worth making. Calvin eventually agreed, as he generally agreed when Gertrude was clearly right, and they began making inquiries. James, who was 3, announced that he was also going to a proper school and that he was going right now. He was redirected to the barn, where he and his father's best herding dog spent a productive afternoon in a manner that satisfied both parties. In the spring of 1888, Gertrude found herself expecting again. She told Calvin on the same porch, in the same October light that had begun to feel like their particular season of significant announcements, and he received the news with the same luminous, unguarded joy as the first time, which she had half expected to be diminished by familiarity and found instead to be entirely unchanged. "Another one," he said, in a tone that was not surprise but wonder. "Another one," she confirmed. "Is it a I don't know yet," she said. "Ada will have opinions. Ada will have specific, well-reasoned opinions with historical precedent," Calvin said. Ada did in fact have opinions. She thought it should be a girl this time for variety. She had prepared a short list of names she considered appropriate, which she presented at breakfast the following Saturday with characteristic thoroughness. James thought it should be a horse. Their daughter was born in June of 1888, in the full heat of the Texas summer, with the same fury and insistence as her brother, but with a great deal more hair, which was dark and thick, and already unmistakably her mother's. They named her Frances, after Calvin's mother, who had been writing hopeful letters about grandchildren for several years. Frances arrived in Dusty Creek by September, on the pretext of meeting her newest grandchild, and stayed for 4 months because the ranch suited her, and she showed no particular urgency about returning to Missouri, a development that no one actively objected to. Ada, who had been waiting for a sister with considerable patience, took Frances's arrival with the gravity appropriate to the assumption of a new responsibility. By the time Frances was 3 months old, Ada had read 3 books on infant care and had opinions about all of them. By the summer of 1889, the Carver Ranch was a full, loud, complicated, deeply alive place, with Calvin at the center of it moving through the days with the solid, purposeful energy of a man who knows exactly where he is supposed to be, and Gertrude at the center of it, moving through the days with the same energy, and both of them occasionally catching each other's eye over the noise of children and ranch hands and Frances's opinions about everything and James's cheerful destruction of various structures, and exchanging a look that contained the whole improbable history of how they had gotten here, and the full measure of how glad they were that they had. Ada left for school in San Antonio in September of 1889, at age 14, on a dry blue morning that was the hardest morning of the year for everyone. She was impressively composed about it, because she was Ada, but Gertrude saw the way she held onto her father for a long moment before climbing into the stage, and the way Calvin's jaw worked while he watched the stage leave, and she took his hand on the walk back to the wagon and kept it all the way home. "She's going to be extraordinary," Gertrude said. "She already is," Calvin said. "Yes," Gertrude agreed. "She learned it somewhere." He looked at her. "From both of you," she said. "You and Ellen both. She is very much both of you." He was quiet for a moment. "Ellen would have liked you," he said. "She would have seen you clearly right away. She was like that." "I think I would have liked her too," Gertrude said, and meant it, because she had come to understand Ellen Carver not as a shadow over her life, but as a part of the foundation of everything she loved, and she held that understanding with care. Ada wrote letters home every 2 weeks. The letters were long, detailed, and opinionated, which surprised no one. She described her classes with enthusiasm, and her instructors with a critical acuity that made both her parents laugh. She made friends, a girl named Ruth who was from a ranch family near Austin, and another named Josephine who was from San Antonio itself, and who Ada described as the most direct person she had ever met, which was saying something. James started school in Dusty Creek that same September, under Miss Holloway rather than his mother, which was Gertrude's deliberate arrangement on the grounds that a boy should have a teacher who was not also his parent. He adapted to Miss Holloway within approximately 3 days, and thereafter treated her with the easy affection he extended to most people in his world, which was everyone on the ranch and several dozen additional individuals he had collected along the way, because James Carver was constitutionally incapable of meeting a person he did not like. Frances, at 15 months, was conducting a comprehensive investigation of every object within her reach, and at no point showing any inclination to slow this down. October of 1889 was the 7th anniversary of the afternoon the pins had fallen in the schoolhouse floor. Gertrude was not the kind of person who kept precise track of such dates, but this one she remembered, because it was October and the light was the same, and she was sitting in the schoolhouse after the children had gone, grading the week's arithmetic papers in the long afternoon light, and she looked up at the window and felt the specific quality of that light and remembered. 7 years since Ada had said please and the pins had fallen and Calvin had stood in the doorway. 7 years since she had stood with her hair down in the schoolhouse and felt, for the first time in years, like a woman who was willing to be seen. She thought about the woman she had been then. 30 years old, contained, careful, carrying a dark past in a locked internal room, and a scarred hand pressed flat against every surface that required steadiness. She thought about the walls and what they had cost her and what she had saved herself from and what she might have missed if Ada had not asked. She thought about what one small child's request, offered in the spirit of love and trust, can do to a life. She heard the wagon on the road outside and looked up, and through the window saw Calvin pulling up in the supply wagon, which he sometimes used now that Ada was gone to bring James home from school rather than letting him walk, because James was 5 and his navigation choices were somewhat optimistic. James jumped down from the wagon bench with complete physical confidence and ran toward the schoolhouse door. Through the window she could see Calvin watching him go and then lifting his eyes to the window where she was sitting. He saw her. He lifted one hand. She raised hers in return. The October light came through the window at the same angle it had always come, and her hair was down around her shoulders because she had stopped pinning it years ago. Gradually at first and then completely, 1 pin fewer each week through the spring of 1884, until one morning she had simply stopped altogether and realized she had made the decision without quite noticing when, and the light in it was the same color it had always been. The dark auburn and copper red that Ada had said looked like a princess, and that Calvin had looked at in the doorframe of this same room as though it was the answer to something. She was not the same woman. She was the same woman, more fully. James burst through the door. "Mama, there was a hawk by the south pasture, and Papa let me watch it for a long time before school, and I'm going to draw it when we get home." "That sounds like an excellent plan," Gertrude said, and gathered her papers and put on her coat and took James's hand, and they went out to where Calvin was waiting on the wagon, patient and steady in the October afternoon, and she climbed up beside him, and he put his arm around her and James squeezed between them, and they drove home east along the creek road with the cottonwoods blazing yellow on both sides and the hawk, probably the same one, wheeling high above the flat country in enormous circles. At home, Frances was conducting further investigations with the assistance of a long-suffering ranch cat. Berta had beef stew on the fire. Ada's latest letter was on the kitchen table, arrived that morning, 6 pages in her precise, energetic hand, describing her discovery of a book on astronomy that she intended to purchase, and her evolving views on the nature of justice, which had apparently shifted somewhat following a vigorous debate in her literature class. Calvin read the letter aloud after supper, which was their custom. James drew his hawk in a notebook with great concentration. Frances fell asleep in her chair with the ranch cat, which had apparently forgiven her the day's investigations. Berta washed the dishes with the unhurried efficiency of a person who has found their work and made their peace with it. Gertrude sat at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup and her hair loose around her shoulders, and listened to her husband's voice reading their daughter's words aloud in the lamplight, and she thought about the word home, which she had not had a comfortable relationship with for a long time. It was this. It was exactly this. Not a place without difficulty or history or the occasional tense conversation about who had made a decision without consulting whom. Not a life without sorrow. Ellen was still present in it, and always would be, in Ada's eyes, and in the particular way Calvin sometimes went quiet on April evenings when the prairie grass came in. Not a life without the memory of dark pasts and broken trust and the specific loneliness of years spent behind walls, but a life in which the walls were down. A life in which she was seen and loved in full view, hair down, scar visible, history known and found to be enough. More than enough. Precisely what was wanted. She thought about Ada on that October afternoon 7 years ago, looking up with those storm-gray eyes and saying the most simple and devastating thing, please, and the pins falling, and the whole long, complicated, luminous consequence of that one small please. She reached across the table and covered Calvin's hand with hers. He paused in his reading and looked at her. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Keep reading." He did. His thumb turned and covered hers, and he kept reading, Ada's voice in his voice, the lamplight steady, the stew pot cooling on the stove, the hawk long settled wherever hawks go in the October dark, the creek running its quiet current out in the night beyond the window, and the whole of it, the whole full, honest, irreplaceable life of it, settled around Gertrude Carver like something she had always been supposed to find. She had been afraid once of being seen. She was not afraid anymore. The pins were on the dresser where she had left them long ago, undisturbed, exactly where they belonged, which was not in her hair. Her hair was down, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.